How do we stop Putin using nuclear weapons? The answer of how to stop a country from using a nuclear weapon has been around since Russia first developed theirs, an established parity with the West. The potential for mutual destruction. But of course, mutual destruction is a horrible, messy situation that will undoubtedly leave the world in ruins, collapsed by under the weight of humanity's inability to coexist peacefully. It's only something you imply in the hope that it never comes to pass. If you wiggle just a little, you give your opponent the feeling that you aren't as strong as you claim, so his actions might just be condoned. The slightest whiff of appeasement can be deadly. With the war in Ukraine having turned against him, Vladimir Putin and various of his cronies have opened the door to a tactical nuclear strike to stop the advancing Ukrainians. Dark Histories strongly believes that this will happen unless the status quo is changed immediately. How do we do that? Well, you don't leave it to the French apparently. Emmanuel Macron very recently declared that the French nuclear policy of only in self-defense applies if Putin fired on Ukraine. Whilst technically true, this was a climb down from the assured mutual destruction policy and more importantly a tacit green light to Putin that he could do as he pleases. More worryingly, this was a huge crack in the NATO armor of solidarity of which France is a big member. If they could step away from this, what else would they step away from? NATO has been plain about its thoughts on a potential nuclear attack, with a senior NATO official saying that a nuclear attack by Russia would almost certainly trigger a military response from Western nations. He said Russia using nuclear weapons would almost certainly be drawing a physical response from many allies, and potentially from NATO itself, and said that Russia would face unprecedented consequences. It came after the joint G7 statement, in which member states including the nuclear-armed US, France, and UK, said, "We reaffirm that any use of chemical, biological or nuclear weapons by Russia would be met with severe consequences." But not that severe, it would appear, as the French leader has blinked first in this case of nuclear chicken. The G7 and NATO did not say what those consequences would be, and whether they would be nuclear or not. In stark contrast to Macron, sleepy Joe Biden has come out rather strong. Which is exactly how this game should be played. Now I am never sure Biden actually meant to say any of it, because frankly the old man should be retired and sitting on his deck watching his grandchildren, but there needs to be the threat of violence in order for your opponent to consider his next move wisely. Old Biden can be a loose cannon, so much so that he has the GOP running scared, unsure of what he will do and say next. Hopefully Putin feels the same as them. That being said, the GOP is so desperate to sideline and criticize Biden, they have forgotten to support the commander-in-chief in this very desperate situation. They should be encouraging him in the hope that it is unnecessary, rather than diminishing him on the world stage and emboldening Putin at the same time. Let's be clear, a nuclear weapon deployed in the Ukraine is still a deployed nuclear weapon, so why help that happen by being soft on Putin? It shows how much the Republicans care. Wouldn't it be nice if our leaders were more like Sanna Marin of Finland?
That's the way out of the conflict.
However, if Putin calls the bluff and deploys a tactical nuke, I have severe doubts that Biden will act in a similar way. I do not believe for a second that he has the stones to respond in kind, and we know that the opposition doesn't. Plus at this point we will in fact descend into a hot war, also known as World War III. But will Putin go nuclear? We believe so. He is after all a dictator with his back to the wall, under pressure from all sides with the defeat staring him in the face. These types of folks tend to act irrationally, despite Sleepy Joe calling him a rational player, recently in an ill-advised walkback of previous statements. Rational players do not invade neighboring countries on a whim and destroy their countries in the process. But would it be easy? Now obviously Russia has tons of nukes lying around, varying yields and varying methods of delivery. But what are the barriers stopping him from doing it? Number one, there is the Western world's response. As already discussed, we personally don't see this being as bad as it should be, and frankly, I think Putin knows it. Number two, how would his own people take it? I think this could be tougher for him. There are already stories of military men from days gone past who avoided a nuclear crisis by simply saying, no. Putin already has loads of protesters and homegrown resistance to his actions. How will they respond if he drops a nuke on a neighbor? I believe the situation could become untenable for him in the long term, but it won't stop the actual deployment. Number 3. What would his allies like China, Tehran, and India think? They would no doubt offer their own condemnation, but would this count for anything? Honestly, we don't think so, as all these allies have their own nuclear deterrent and their own local problems. They would want to keep the nuclear option on the table, so to attack Russia over its use could be counterproductive. Think China and Taiwan as an example. Number 4. Prevailing winds could send the fallout straight into Russia, with the obvious problems associated with that. We see this more as a delaying issue rather than a preventing one. Also, I have never thought Putin to care much about his people and will probably chalk wind-borne radiation up to acceptable losses. Number 5. Will his armed forces actually pull the trigger for him? Here he has his greatest challenge. Unless he 100% assured of the loyalty of those in charge of the actual act, I would be very concerned that this order is ignored. We believe that far too many men have died, and the organization of the war has been such a shambles that he has lost a huge amount of credibility in the armed forces for this to work. That being said, it is not a guarantee, and he could conceivably leave the triggering of this weapon to a group like Wagner. There are obviously other things counting against him, and we hope that merely mentioning it within the walls of the Kremlin will spark an insurrection that sees him overthrown. However, there is another way we can stop this. Give the government of Ukraine 10 tactical nuclear weapons and the means to deploy them. They are less likely to use it on their own soil and can obviously be threatened with isolation if they did, but give them the weapon. They need to assure the threat of mutual destruction. I truly believe that Zelensky can be relied on to act rationally despite what Putin has done to him and his country. This will move the West out of the conversation and make this a localized issue, and thereby lessen the conversation on nuclear Armageddon. As they say in The Mandalorian, this is the way. Thank you for watching. Please drop a like and subscribe.